Good evening and welcome to Sunday Night Bible Study with Pastor Josiah of Witten Baptist Church. Today we start our study on the book of James. This is my favorite way to teach, just expositionally, going from start to finish through a book of the Bible, not skipping a single word, not skipping any hard parts or difficult parts. We go through the entire book. So this is my favorite way to teach. We haven't done it in a while, so here we go. We did it with Hebrews 13, but not through a whole book. So here we go, the whole book of James. First off, let's talk about the writer. Now, remember, we use the phrase writer because God is the author. Okay, He's the author of every book, but there are writers. There's 40-something writers in the Bible. James, there are four Jameses, four people named James in the New Testament. One is the father of Judas, not Judas Iscariot, different Judas. He's only mentioned once in the Bible. He's almost assuredly not the writer of this. There are two apostles named James. There is James the Lesser, and then James, some people call him the Greater, John's brother. Okay? So, when we have those are two of the 12 apostles. Okay? James the Lesser is probably called James the Lesser because he is. Some people think it's because he was younger. Some people think it's because he was shorter. In fact, if you watch The Chosen, you have Big James and Little James. That's likely what it was. That's John's brother. But then we have James, the half brother of Jesus, and that is almost assuredly who wrote this book. How do I know that? Well, because James, John's brother, was killed by Herod in Acts chapter 12. Herod put him to death with the sword. So that leaves almost assuredly James, Jesus' brother, as the writer of the book of James. Let me tell you a little bit about Jesus' brother James. At first, he was an unbeliever. John chapter 7, verse 5 says that all of Jesus' brothers and sisters were unbelievers. Paul is the one who tells us that Jesus actually appeared to James, his brother, after the resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15. Meaning that it was him seeing his resurrected brother for him to finally realize that he was more than just his brother, that he was the eternal Son of God. James was the pastor of the church in Jerusalem. We read about that. In fact, Paul calls him one of the pillars of the churches in Galatians chapter 2. In Acts chapter 15, we see how much pull James has, in that in Acts chapter 15, there's something called the Jerusalem Council. This took place in 49 AD. And this is where Paul, Barnabas, Peter, James, they were all gathered together because, get this, even though Jesus had already said, they were arguing over whether or not circumcision was necessary for salvation, even though Jesus had already answered that question. So it took a whole council for Paul, Barnabas, Peter, and James to agree that circumcision is not necessary for salvation. James presided over that meeting because he was the pastor in Jerusalem where the council took place. Since James does not mention that council, which took place in 49 AD in the book of James, many people think that James, like me, that James was written before 49 AD. Which means that James or Galatians, one of the two of them, were the first books written in the New Testament. So when we read the book of James, understand that this was written before Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, any of that stuff. This is either the first or second New Testament book written. So what I want to do today is just read and study just for a little bit verses 1 through 8, and then we'll be done. James, a slave of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. Greetings. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all and without criticizing, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith, without doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. That person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord, for he is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Just want to walk through these 8 verses and we'll call it good for today. First off, James calls himself a slave of Jesus because he's recognized he's no longer just his brother. To the 12 tribes in the dispersion. James is writing this to Jewish Christians. Now, today when you hear Jew, you think of a rich white person with a funny hat on their head. That is a religious idea of Jew. When we have Jew here, we are talking about ethnically Jewish. The Jews have been dispersed, first by Assyria in 722, and then by Babylon in 586, so on and so forth. The Romans. Persecution broke out when Herod killed James, John's brother. Persecution broke out before that when they killed Stephen and stoned him. So they're being dispersed and taking the gospel with them. And James is writing to Jewish Christians throughout the known world, encouraging them to endure various trials. And he says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds." Now, when you hear that, you should think that that makes no sense. Why would you count it joy when you experience various trials? He says, because the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. Now, God tempts nobody, as we read, but he does test. There is something to be said when you speak to a believer who's been a believer for many decades, because they are able to look back on their life and see how God has brought them through it. You know, the people that um, people that appreciate peace the most are the ones who've been ravaged by war. The people that appreciate food the most are those who have actually been hungry before. I cannot compare to that at all. But I will say, when we've gone on mission trips before, and let's say we didn't have hot water for 10 days, not a long time for most people in the world, but for me, I was not used to that. When we got back to the States and I turned on the hot water in my house, I was just like, oh my gosh, and I stayed in there for 45 minutes, right? The testing of your faith produces endurance, steadfastness. One of the marks of a Christian is, what can your faith endure? Does it fold at the smallest bit of opposition? Or can you endure through it? Pastor Jeff often says, there are the many people who call themselves Christians whose faith is a mile wide and an inch deep. These are the people, when you ask them how they're doing, they'll say, blessed and highly favored, but inside they're full of dead man's bones. They have no substance to their faith because it's never been tested. Or when it is tested, they just fold up. But count it all joy when it's tested, because the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, endurance. When I was fighting, I always had butterflies before I fought. But the moment that I became more comfortable is when I finally realized, I've done this 1,000 times before. And this guy in front of me is no scarier than these 3 guys before. So that whatever I'm about to face, I've already faced it before and overcome it. The testing of your faith produces endurance, because you can look back and see, well, God brought me through A, B, and C, so this is no different. The testing of that faith produces that type of endurance. But, verse 4, it must have its full effect. You can't fold up and run away from it. You've got to face it. It must have its full effect, so you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all and without criticizing, and it will be given to him. God doesn't even say, I told you so. You know when someone does you a favor and they hold it over your head for the next 6 months and you think in your head that was not worth the favor? If any of you lacks wisdom, discernment, he should ask of God, who gives to all generously and without criticizing. But let him ask in faith, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. All these things from the world, just throw your faith. You read one article, you hear one thing about this or that, and your faith is just driven about to and fro. You have no stability because you have not endured trials. Enduring trials is how you face stability, so that when you hear something on the news, you're not freaking out. Like, what's the world coming to? It's coming exactly to the point that God said it was going to. For that person must not suppose that he'll receive anything from the Lord. For a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. And we'll end here. Jesus said you cannot serve 2 masters. James, his brother, is saying the same thing, that a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. I am really bad at multitasking. Some people are great at it, but I am not. When it comes to your master, you cannot be a multitasker. For Jesus says you will love one and hate the other, or hate one and love the other. He doesn't even say that you'll just moderately like both. It's all or nothing. It's an absolute with Jesus. You will love one and hate the other, or you'll love this one and hate this one. A double-minded man is unstable in all his ways, because he's divided. Christian, let us be a people that are single-minded, focused on God, single-minded, focused on His Word, because anything else, we will be unstable in all of our ways. You have to be committed to God. And the greatest showing of that commitment is obedience to Him. And if James is telling you anything else, it's this, that if you don't feel like enduring it, to do it anyway. Because when you come on the other side, you will be stable, not tossed by the winds, and not unstable in all your ways. We endure trials because we will be refined and come out of it stronger, so that when the next one comes, we're not as shaken as easily. We'll stop there in verse 8. That is just an intro to the book of James. We're going to go through the whole book and not skip anything. We're going to exposit the entire book and go through every word. Love you guys. I hope this was beneficial to you in some way. I will catch up with you guys next week. God bless.